Okay, so now we're homing in on this. So the nuanced position of Mises. So there's an apparent paradox here that Mises at times condemns fractional reserve banking in his writings, yet elsewhere he praises free banking. Okay, and so, and this is what confused me when I was younger and I was at least open to the fractional reserve banking position. I thought, the people in that camp would offer a lot of quotations from Mises, and they would say, look, Mises is on board with us, it's just you cranky Rothbardians who don't get it. And it looked pretty compelling to me at the time. And I was like, yeah, he's praising free, but he said, I don't have the quotes at my fingertips, but he says stuff like, even in Human Action, he also says it earlier, he says things like, laissez-faire should never have been abandoned in banking, that the only way to ensure stability in the financial sector is to have a return to free banking. Free banking is the only thing that can avoid the recurring boom-bust cycle. Okay, so if you're somebody like Larry White or Selgin, that looks like a slam dunk. You're quoting Mises, endorsing free banking, what's the problem? But then the 100% reserve people, the Rothbardians in this tradition, can also point, for example, here's one. So this is from Human Action, right? So it's not like I'm going to when Mises was an angry young man or something. This is the mature Mises. He's so upset about how they lost in the trench warfare. He can't believe it. All right. So Human Action, the Scholars Edition, this is from page 439, footnote 17. Let's not overlook footnote 17, all right? I'm sick of people overlooking footnote 17. Page 439, this is Mises. The notion of normal credit expansion is absurd. Issuance of additional fiduciary media, no matter what its quantity may be, always sets in motion those changes in the price structure, the description of which is the task of the theory of the trade cycle. Okay, so he's writing in this very Germanic style. That might be hard to hear and translate, but he's saying there's no such thing as a normal credit expansion. Any issue of new fiduciary media sets in motion the trade cycle. Okay, that's what Mises is talking about. By the way, that wasn't just my voice doing it. Mises, it really does have quotation marks. He says the notion of normal credit expansion, right? And so he himself is doing the Dr. Evil thing also. My latest plan to overcome Austin Powers, I will have the commercial banks issue normal credit expansion, right? Excuse me, Dr. Evil. What is it, number 2? There's no such thing as normal credit expansion. Always sets in motion the trade cycle. People, I've been frozen for 30 frickin' years here. I haven't read Human Action. Throw me a bone. I'm only quasi-Austrian. Okay. The 6 of you have seen that movie, really like that part. All right. Guido just walked in. I'm like, he's going to wonder, what am I doing? All right. Okay, so what's the resolution here? It's a paradox. Mises, on the one hand, seems to agree with guys like Salerno and Rothbard who are saying any credit expansion causes the boom-bust cycle. Hang on, I don't want people to think I'm being slippery. Mises concludes that footnote by saying, of course, if the additional amount issued is not large, neither are the inevitable effects of the expansion. Okay, so, and this also ties into where Mises is coming from, why he's not contradicting himself. So he's saying any credit expansion sets in motion the boom-bust cycle, but of course, if it's a tiny little credit expansion, it's going to be a little business cycle, right? So that's what his position is. And so how can it be that he also has those passages where he endorses free banking? And so the answer is, and this is where I saw the best expression of this in Salerno, but others believe this as well, where, and I'm saying he reconciles all, and I'm putting it in question marks just because I'm not claiming I've read every single thing Mises ever wrote, but when I was, the months I was preparing for that debate with Selgin, and I was reading the various things from Mises, once I had this possibility in mind, everything made sense that Mises wrote throughout his career. Because he has all sorts of things, like if you look at what is called the theory of money and credit, the current version of it, there's essays that are included in there that came out later, and he has proposals for like how to return to monetary stability in the United States or some hypothetical little country somewhere. And he has various things talking about, well, they should freeze the lock in the price of gold in terms of their currency, and then insist on 100% reserves from that point forward, and da-da-da-da. And so I'm saying all that stuff, like his classic canonical treatment in Human Action, his earlier stuff in the theory of money and credit, his later, policy proposals, if you will, and all that stuff, this makes it all make perfect sense. Again, it doesn't mean he's right. We're not saying that, because Mises said it, it's right, but it's just showing there is a consistency there. And so the point is, he was saying that, credit expansion the issue of new fiduciary media, so fractional reserve banking, that necessarily causes the boom-bust cycle in the way the Austrians talk about it. And if you think about it, that makes sense, right? Because what is the boom-bust cycle? And again, if you haven't heard it yet, you wouldn't know, but that's the lecture that's coming up later, is that the interest rate is not doing its job, right? The interest rate is supposed to somehow indicate the relative scarcity of savings versus potential uses. I'm speaking very loosely here. And so if the interest rate is artificially low, that's the wrong price. It's going to set things in motion, right? If the market prices have to be right for them to do what they're supposed to do, so if the interest rate's artificially low, that's going to do something bad. And Mises elaborated and said the bad thing is it sets in motion an unsustainable boom. Okay, so the point is, it makes perfect sense that, credit expansion would do that. That's how there would be, in a sense, it's like people think there are more savings than there really are. And it makes sense that banks issuing more tickets, more claims on money than people voluntarily relinquished, it fits together. So there's not some weird arbitrary position. It makes perfect sense that Mises would think this. Okay, but why is he then endorsing free banking? Well, because again, remember what free banking means, and that's why I was saying there's the quotation marks. I'm a free banker if what that means is I don't want the Federal Reserve micromanaging bank policy. I think the best thing to do is completely separate banking and state and money and state, and just let the chips fall where they may. And we can speculate on what would happen in a totally libertarian legal framework, but for right now, I don't want the government regulating banks. And Mises says, he says at least one spot, I don't know if it's in Human Action, it might be somewhere else, but he's saying because even if the government came in and engaged in 100%, a rule about 100% reserves, and by the way, his views on this changed over time. I told you he does have proposals where he does want the government to at least announce this rule, but as far as regulating banks, he does, at least at one point in his career, say the public would then trust that was going to solve the problem, and then the next time there was a serious crisis, the authorities would throw in the towel because they're cowards and they wouldn't be willing to do the hard thing and insist on 100% reserves even though there was a crisis, and they would go ahead and allow inflation, and then that would spoil it. So Mises thought the best long-term approach to limit fractional reserve banking is just to not have the government involved at all, and so the banks that are engaging it too aggressively are going to go under. And Mises has a great argument that we can't get into here. I spell it out in my book Choice if you want to get that and just look at the chapter on money and banking. Mises has a great argument about how if one bank tries to inflate too much, its reserves quickly get drained to all of the competing banks. And so that at least would keep any individual bank in check, and then the system as a whole couldn't get too risky because then some new person would open up a bank with a higher reserve ratio and all the reserves would go to that bank. So Mises thought if you had laissez-faire in banking where you regulate them as much as you regulate pizza shops, then at least that would contain the excesses of fractional reserve banking. It wouldn't be 100% reserve banking. There would still be little boom-bust cycles, but at least it would contain the major part of the problem. So I think if you think that's what he means and you go and read his stuff, it makes perfect sense, and there's no inconsistency. It's not that on Tuesdays he seems to favor Larry White and George Selgin, and on Thursdays he switches to Salerno. It all makes perfect sense. Again, he might be wrong. We're not saying because he said that he's right, but I would say, if you believe in Austrian business cycle theory, it's kind of awkward for you if both Mises and Hayek think that credit expansion causes the business cycle. Again, I think it's pretty convenient for our point of view. All right, so